Hi, this is our course, An American Tale, the Migration Story in the Music of George and Ira Gershwin. In this interactive, interdisciplinary course, we focus on the life and times and music of George and Ira Gershwin in conjunction with the migration of African Americans and Eastern European Jews to New York City in the early part of the 20th century, when two iconic enclaves, the Jewish Lower East Side and Black Harlem, were established. This course will tell the story of Black and Jewish migration to New York City, accompanied by the music of African American, European, and Jewish artists, illustrated by the art of Jacob Lawrence and photography of Louis Hine, and enriched by the words of Harlem Renaissance and Jewish American poets. This is a classic American tale of migration, encounter, and exchange that led to the creation of the Gershwin legacy in music, in theater, and in jazz. Jewish migration to the Lower East Side is our first unit this week. It's based on the Columbia History of Jews and Judaism in America, edited by Mark Lee Raphael. It's also based on two books by Hasia Diner, The Jews of the United States, and In the Almost Promised Land, American Jews and Blacks, 1915 to 1935. And our last book, Black Harlem and the Jewish Lower East Side, edited by Catherine Rottenberg, rounds out our books that were used to create this part of our unit. In 1855, when Walt Whitman published the first edition of Leaves of Grass, his anthology of revolutionary free verse poetry, critics responded harshly, calling it noxious fumes and barbaric yop. Perhaps this initial rejection of his poetry and his lifestyle made Whitman especially sensitive to the plight of migrants. He inspired both Jewish and African American poets. These words from his poem, "You, whoever you are," starts our look at the Jewish migration to the Lower East Side. Let's read the quote and then consider two major themes that we will look at in this unit. Each of us is inevitable. Each of us is limitless. Each of us with his or her right upon the earth. Each of us allowed the eternal purports of the earth. Each of us here as divinely as any is here. Let's consider that the Great Migration and Eastern European Jewish immigration were part of an international migration pattern. They did not happen in a vacuum. Let's also consider that the similar yet unique experiences of African Americans and Jewish Americans as migrants in the United States. When looking at both migrations, we will look at major themes of migration. These themes will help you compare the two migrations. First of all, we'll always look at some statistics of the migration. Then we'll look at push factors, reasons why people left their homelands. The pull factors, why do they come to the United States and particularly New York City? Let's take a look at their journey. We'll also take a look at a concept called chain migration. The settlements that they created, what they were like, what they were composed of. Work and mobility, how did these folks earn a living? We'll then also take a look at the reception of native-born peoples to these migrants, as well as their reaction and their adjustment to American life, the assistance that they received, and their attempt at assimilation. In 1820 to 1920, 45 million immigrants came to the United States, 3 million of these are Jews. From 1880 to 81 to 1924, 2.5 million East European Jewish immigrants come to the United States. That's a number 10 times over the previous 6 decades. 1/3 of East European Jews leave the European continent. Let's take a look at this map, Jewish population density in Europe. As we can see, Jewish population was highly concentrated in Central and Eastern Europe. From 1881 to 1910, 1.5 million Jewish immigrants came to the United States. About 840,000 of these were from Russia, approximately 130,000 from Austria-Hungary. Indeed, the vast majority of immigration from this area was the Jewish population. Who were these Jews that came from Central and Eastern Europe to the United States? They tended to be single young adults, able to work long hours. They were women as well as young men. And birth order and age were often a determination on their decision to migrate. Now, what were some of the push factors, those reasons why they left this area of Eastern Europe? First of all, we had a population explosion, particularly in Eastern and Southern Europe. It skyrocketed before 1880. In 1800, there were 1.25 million people in this area. By 1900, there were 6.5 million people, despite migration to the United States and no migration to the area. Economic factors were all based in scarcity. There was a tremendous amount of economic stress as a result because of the scarcity of resources, the scarcity of jobs, and the scarcity of opportunities. Jewish trades were in decline, particularly the needle trade and merchandising or peddling. This was due to advances in industrialization, which led to the needle trades becoming obsolete, and the railroads coming in and bringing goods which had previously been traded by Jewish peddlers. Industrial jobs were less than the number of people who wanted them. Clearly, the European economy was not sustainable. The bitter poverty that particularly Galician Jews suffered amongst the poorest in Europe were conditions that were even worse than in Russia. But also political reasons were push factors in immigration to the United States at this time. It starts with particularly Tsarist policies in Russian Poland, started by Catherine the Great and then her successors. Catherine the Great established the Pale of Jewish Settlement, which is currently the states of Lithuania, Belarus, Poland, Moldova, Ukraine, parts of Western Europe, basically the lands extending from the Baltic Sea to the Black Sea. Those Jewish communities not in the Pale, this shaded area of the map, were destroyed. And movement in the Pale was highly restricted. Jews were forbidden to live in agricultural communities or large cities such as Kiev and Yalta. Shtetls, small towns or villages with large Jewish populations, were concentrated throughout the Pale, and they became easy targets. However, under the Tsar liberator, Alexander II, great reforms did occur. You had the end of serfdom, a government that was more efficient and orderly, many judicial reforms, and the reform of local government. Under Alexander II, there was a new category called useful Jews, merchants, university students, craftsmen, medical personnel that were allowed to live outside the Pale in cities like St. Petersburg, for example, where these useful Jews acquired a Western education and new wealth. But because these reforms left the autocracy untouched, and they were too little and too late, a radical opposition rose to the reign of Alexander II. There were people who wanted peaceful change, but there were those who thought no change was going to happen without violence. And terroristic groups rose, one like the People's Will, who successfully assassinated Alexander II in 1881. The reactionary politics of Alexander III, with its extreme nationalism, Russification, and anti-Semitism, had a huge impact on the Jews. They had no rights. They were harassed by authorities. There were restrictions on urban Jews and educational institutions. And then the beginning of the dreaded pogroms. The first wave of pogroms began in 1881 and lasted until 1884. Under the reactionary politics of Alexander III, and please remember the extreme nationalism and anti-Semitism that flourished, on April 15th, 1881, the first pogrom occurred in Elizabethgrad. There was the destruction of property, mass murder, and terrorism of the Jewish population with impunity. Local officials were either indifferent, idle, or complicit in the looting and destruction. By the end of the year, over 300 attacks had occurred through southern and southwestern Russia. The pogroms would continue until 1884. And the government blamed the Jews for exploiting the peasants, giving them reason to react with the violence. The impact on the Jewish community in Russia in 1882 was made possible by the May or temporary laws. They prohibited Jewish settlement in large numbers in rural villages or Pale. The Jews were not allowed to rent or buy property. Jews were removed from the lucrative liquor trade and the selling on Sundays and holidays. And there were to be no civil service jobs for Jews. The May laws forced 500,000 Jews from their homes. Then there was the second wave in 1903 to 1906. This second wave is centered around the Russo-Japanese War and the Revolution of 1905, a very tumultuous period in Russian history. In this second wave, ultra-conservative forces that supported the government policies and conservative gangs were tolerated, and they thrived on anti-Semitism. The pogroms were actually incited by the Russian government. In 1903, for example, in Kishinev, which is the current capital of Moldova, Chisinau, 45 Jews were murdered, 1,300 homes and shops were destroyed. In 1905, in Odessa, 400 Jews were murdered, 1,600 properties destroyed. No one is arrested or convicted for this wave of violence. Impunity. The third wave of pogroms is centered around the First World War, probably the most tumultuous time in Russian history. There were 1,326 pogroms across the Ukraine. 30,000 to 70,000 people, we're not quite sure, but tens of thousands murdered, thousands and thousands of women raped, hundreds of shtetls destroyed, at least 500,000 left homeless. This third wave was conducted by Ukrainian nationalists and the white volunteer army troops centered around Kiev. The impacts of the pogroms in Europe left the Jews of Russia a haunted people. They faced the impossibility of ever integrating into Russian society. And the Jews will turn to two political ideologies: Marxist socialism, based in the workers' movement in Russia, Poland, and Lithuania, and Zionism, the feeling that until the Jews had a homeland, they would be subject to hostility at will. And the desire for a Jewish homeland became one of the political impacts of the pogroms. But the pogroms had an impact in America as well. Emma Lazarus, an American poet, had a writer's response. In 1882, she wrote Songs of a Semite, decrying the pogroms and the fate of Jews in Russia. She held the Christians responsible. But then in 1883, perhaps her most famous writing, The New Colossus, was published. You can find it on the base of the Statue of Liberty. Yes, that poem. Poems can often be used as historical sources in a history class. And this course has designed a poetry analysis guide. Try it out on Emma Lazarus's The New Colossus. This guide is a process by which you can use with any poem. The historical background of the author, the historical context of the poem, with using the text of the poem, is emphasized. Words of emotion are analyzed, indicating the poet's ability to persuade. And then students are asked to express in their own words the poet's message. Poetry is short. Kids love poetry. The New Colossus, a classic American poem, should be analyzed within the historical context of the pogroms and the Jewish immigration to New York City. The impacts of the pogroms in the United States were also felt by political events. We had mass protests in the United States. For example, in 1903 alone, 80 rallies from Boston to San Francisco occurred. And sympathy was expressed for Russian Jewish immigrants. American Jews were galvanized politically. The NAACP, at its inaugural meeting in 1909, passed a resolution condemning the pogroms, offering sympathy for the victims, and linking the violence that African Americans experienced in the U.S. to those that Jews experienced in Russia. American Jews turned to two ideologies: the American Jewish community, established by the wealthy Jewish elite, highly involved in assimilation in American society, and then the American Jewish Congress, heavily Eastern European, mass-based, and its purpose was, and I quote, for Jewish American organized to defend Jewish interests at home and abroad through public policy, advocacy, using diplomacy, legislation, and the courts. We know that there were economic as well as political reasons for the fleeing of Eastern Europe by its Jews. Why did they come to the United States? What were some of the pull factors? One of the pull factors was the rise of the garment industry in the United States. Due to the enormous industrialization of the United States, particularly after the Civil War, what would happen was the Jewish settlement in New York would dovetail with Jewish work experience in the Old World, particularly the needle trades and peddling. If we take a look at the garment industry, by the time of the arrival of the mass migration of Jews to New York City, the United States was the premier place as the world's manufacturer of ready-made clothes. There were events that revolutionized the garment industry. One is, of course, the sewing machine. For little capital, you could buy machines, then hire workers, particularly in the shirt and dress industry. Due to fixed sizes as a result of the Civil War and the mass manufacturing of Civil War uniforms, now ready-made clothes to be bought off the rack were obtainable. There were more working-class women needing clothing for their new secretarial positions. New manufacturing, new consumers, the garment industry takes off in the United States, just as Eastern European Jews, many of them out-of-work tailors, come to the United States. Jews will dominate the garment industry. Sweatshops and factories will be in Jewish hands. 60% of all Jews are in the garment industry. 75% of all garment workers are Jewish, men and women. Jews will work for other Jews, having the same language and the same history. Earlier arriving Jews become the model of mobility for the recent immigrants. Another pull factor to the United States is that of merchandising. There might have been a decline of peddling which pushed Jews out of Europe, but in the industrialization of the United States, an increase in demand for entrepreneurs to satisfy the desires of consumers was needed. Pre-1880, German Jewish peddlers were in every state in the United States. Some of our most famous department stores, like Saks, Macy's, and Gimbel's, were all created in the early part of the 20th century by German Jews. These German Jews would share a common language with the Eastern European Jews, and they would act as wholesalers, linking the new immigrants to their merchandise. Also, there were newspapers like the Israelite and the Jewish Messenger, which linked places through print. Jewish merchandising spread throughout the continent. After 1880, when the vast majority of our Eastern European Jews are coming into the United States, the bulk of industrial laborers in the mines and steel mills were from Eastern Europe. Jews from Eastern Europe could communicate with these workers, and they became the small town shopkeepers in mining communities. We have an expansion of the trading network with some of the largest Jewish cities in the United States becoming not only New York City, but Chicago, Philadelphia, Boston, Cleveland, Detroit, Newark, Pittsburgh, and San Francisco. Another pull factor, of course, luring new immigrants from Central and Eastern Europe to the United States were our democratic values of freedom and democracy, the chance to achieve equality. These values not possible in Central and Eastern Europe under autocratic rule. But let's remember that migration is a personal choice, a selective process. Migrants must balance opportunities in America with their problems at home. We have reasons to leave. We have reasons pulling immigrants to America. The journey, because of new transportation systems, particularly railroads and steamships, are not only faster, but affordable. Receiving the newcomers would be the process centers at Castle Garden until 1892, and that of Ellis Island from 1892 to 1954. Pre-1880, newcomers went to port cities and interior cities, and Jews were in all 50 states, particularly as merchants. But the post-1880 Jewish immigration would be to New York City, particularly the Lower East Side. Now, the Lower East Side is the lower part of Manhattan, south of 14th Street, north of Fulton, between Broadway and the East River. The Jewish population in New York City surged. From 1880 to 1890, only 60,000 Jews in Lower Manhattan. But by 1915, 975,000 Jews will live in New York City, and they will form 28% of the population. In 1924, 1.765 million will live in New York City. By 1927, they will be 44% of the New York population, thus making New York City the largest concentration of Jews in the world and the hub of American Jewish life. Why New York City? Why particularly the Lower East Side? Well, the Lower East Side was close to the points of entry, Castle Garden or Ellis Island. Settlements rose near train stations and ports, exactly where the garment factories were located. To live in the Lower East Side was inexpensive and to be close to work. And when you think about it, by 1910, New York City was producing 70% of women's clothing and 40% of men's clothing in the United States. The Lower East Side, the garment industry, Jewish population surges. Oftentimes, the Lower East Side is called the Plymouth Rock of American Jewish history. It was a diverse area, the Lower East Side, yet it was predominantly Jewish. Jews often identified the Lower East Side with the lower classes, and there was certainly extreme poverty in the Lower East Side, and the view of the Lower East Side was best from your rearview mirror. Most people wanted to exodus the Lower East Side. As Anzia Yezierska said in Salome of the Tenements, the teeming ghetto, the haggling pushcart peddlers, and the dirt and din of screaming hucksters. Take her away from the crowded windows that hung dirty mattresses and bedding, flaunting banners of poverty. But the Lower East Side was where Jews morphed from a racial category to an ethnicity, where Jews made it in the white world, where Jews moved into the mainstream. Now, the Lower East Side, with its Jewishness, is emphasized, even celebrated. A fear of loss of ethnic and religious particularity has occurred particularly since World War II. There are two really wonderful museums here on the Lower East Side. The Tenement Museum, which recreates tenement life, and then the museum at Eldridge Street, which is the site of the first congregation of Russian Jews in America, the Eldridge Street Synagogue, formed in 1887. There are teacher resources on the outline that you will get. Check them out. And if you're ever in New York City, don't fail to stop at the Tenement Museum or the Eldridge Street Synagogue. They're truly magnificent historical sites.